Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'd like to welcome our guest artist, Bahar Noorizadeh, who will be giving this lecture as part of the project Measuring Life, Notes Towards an Impossible Exchange, developed by Dar al-Funun in the aftermath of the pandemic, and featuring a series of invocations that interrogate systems of value embedded in hegemonic representations of life and the economy. Bahar Noorizadeh is an artist, writer, and filmmaker. She works on the reformulation of hegemonic time narratives as they collapse in the face of speculation, philosophical, financial, legal, futural, etc. Noorizadeh's practice traces the relationship between aesthetics and reason and the desubjectification of experience as a pathway for producing new social subjects. Her work has appeared in the Tate Modern Artist Cinema Program, London, Berlinale Forum Expanded in Berlin, Biennale of Moving Images in Geneva, Nanjing International Art Festival, Beirut Art Center, National Gallery of Art, Washington, and Toronto International Film Festival, among others. Noorizadeh's current research examines the intersections of finance, contemporary art, and emerging technology via the shared imperatives of systematic regulation. She is pursuing this work as a PhD candidate in art practice at Goldsmiths, University of London. Welcome, Bahar. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Bahar will be speaking for 45 minutes, after which we'll be opening up the space for conversation and Q&A. Thank you, and Bahar, you can start whenever you're ready.
Great. Thanks so much, Jude, Firas, Reem, for the invitation. This is an amazing program. I feel very lucky to present something here. So I want to talk about my most recent research that's going to be realized as a video in the next few months. It actually came out of the last video project I did after scarcity, which was basically tracking the history of the contingent history of Soviet cybernetics planning in the 20th century. And while I was doing that research, my concern was to look into these different histories or narratives of network design that don't comply with the capitalist imagination of how networks function. And completely by chance, I came upon this other similar or parallel history in the Soviet Union, but this time in the field of architecture and urban planning in the early 20th century Soviet avant-garde. I wanted to bring that up into after scarcity somehow, but it would just be too much content. So this would be somehow a second chapter to that film. So before further ado, I'm just gonna start getting into it. So basically in 1920s Russia, the quotidian was the experimental site for revolutionary practice. And the everyday life of the nation, which the Russian word beat is supposed to signify, the everyday life was a primary concern for the state. As surges of migrants were moving from the countryside to the cities. And housing was a hot topic for city planning competitions and central committee meetings in Moscow. Many architects and urbanists emerging out of the avant-garde wing of Vichutemas, which was the higher art and technical studio school founded in Moscow in 1920s, they basically came up with solutions to the housing shortage. And one of these collectives was the constructivist architecture group OSA, very prominent. historically speaking. And basically they rose to the challenge of inventing a socialist urban design from scratch during their 5-year run from 1925 to 1930. And most famously within these plans that they submitted was the Narkomfin communal building, which is shown in this slide. And Narkomfin was a perfect example of the beat that the OSA architects had in mind. The architect of this building, Moise Ginsberg, he was basically concerned for a long time with the problems of communal dwelling inside cities. And he was an avid follower of Le Corbusier's urbanist modernism. The building was commissioned to house, initially to house the employees of the Ministry of Finance, who were being basically perceived as socially advanced individuals at the time. And it was thought that they could appreciate the subtleties of the architectural vision. So in terms of design, Narkomfin is a ribbon-shaped long building in sharp angles and occasional curves, with a bridge connecting the residential condominium to the collective cubicle on the left, bearing a glass facade. The structure was divided into F-type and K-type units, with F-type units basically being fully collectivized. This was in adherence with feminist ideals and revolutionary antipathy for the nuclear family and female housework. So the F-type units, amenities, kitchen, and the kindergarten were basically shared in the adjoining blocks. The residents' only restriction around this time, while the architecture was, the building was being built, was to hold gatherings on the unfinished roof garden. Because in a few decades, until the construction was completed, the American embassy moved across the street from in its current location. That's basically across the street from Narkomfin, and the rooftop garden would have an exclusive view of its territory, so it immediately became banned. While I was researching after scarcity in Moscow, I actually visited Narkomfin a few times, and there's a reconstruction and renovation project going on at the moment. They have an Instagram account you can check, but as you can imagine, basically all these units are being turned into luxury lofts because they seem like they can facilitate that idea quite well. And the project is actually run by Ginsberg's grandson. So to continue, neither Marx nor Lenin had any fondness for utopian communes. Marx, he had reproached utopian socialists of the 18th century for their pastoral naivete, as he imagined, that could exacerbate poverty, and seeing as the residents of these communes were deprived of technological means. Lenin later would also say that building communes in a rush might alienate the peasants, but he would not oppose them as long as they remained functional. In 19th century pre-revolutionary Russia, commune living, however, was much in vogue. From peasants, religious communities to populists and later followers of Tolstoy, communes represented a tradition of egalitarianism and redistribution of plowlands in old villages. Most famously, the Krynitsa colony was founded by a princess who desired the life of the pre-Soviet intelligentsia, which was a vague socialism plus nihilism. And she sold her jewelry and founded a community on the Caucasian Black Sea coast, which survived successive wars and revolutions until it was transformed into a Soviet state farm later on. These communal folklore had inspired the Erlang sociologist Mikhail Okhitovich. who by some accounts was the most radical of the OSA's avant-garde front. By 1930, Okhitovic managed to insert his critique of OSA's earlier proposed house communes into their program, arguing for a choice in type of housing. So basically, the rumor goes that this is how the story is told, that one summer morning in 1929, Okhitovic rushes into the office of Moise Ginsburg at Khoutemas, and he shuts the door firmly behind him. And when he exits an hour later, Ginsburg, who for his entire life was a staunch disciple of Le Corbusier's urbanisme, he was a converted disturbance. And for the rest of his life, basically, Ginsburg was reproached for changing his mind and his ideology so quickly. So the idea basically was disturbanism recognized the city as a capitalist invention. This was Okhitovic's original ideas. So city was a capitalist invention, and centralization and overcrowding in cities would necessarily lead to class formation. The addition of social housing, parks, and public spaces were futile efforts to cure the city from a terminal disease, the capitalist contagion. Instead, Okhitovic suggested that the city must perish. In its place, there has to be a distributed network of dwellings and services disseminated across the Soviet land. And this would resolve what they thought to be the internal contradiction of the city. In a true communist society, urban amenities would have to be accessible in the countryside as well. So what was like at some point just a few years back a pie in the sky was now possible thanks to the revolution in transportation. So in this picture on the left, basically this is the map of Moscow on the top left side, and as you see, it's like a piece of paper being crumbled and thrown away. They really wanted to get rid of Moscow. So Okhitovic was basically saying that with the advancements in the technologies of transportation and the revolution in transportation, now centralization loses its meaning. So as he says, in the OSA journal, it's necessary to reassess the nature of the possible in accordance with the requirements of the epoch. The question to be elucidated is now, must the different functions of the city exist in one body? Will they become fatally estranged by separation as the parts of a living organism would be? The exceptional growth in the strange quality, quantity, and speed of the means of mechanical transport now permits separation from centers. Space is here measured by time, and this time is itself beginning to be shortened. The revolution in transportation, the automobilization of the territory, reverses all the usual arguments about the inevitability of congestion and the crowding together of buildings and apartments. We ask ourselves, where will we resettle all the urban population and enterprises? Answer, not according to the principle of crowding, but according to the principle of maximum freedom, ease, and speed of communications possibilities. So what form of residential architecture could support this feral image of a mobile city? Disturbanists suggested collapsible, lightweight living cells per individual. Oh yeah, here. So they suggested these collapsible, lightweight living cells per individuals that could be wrapped up and transported across the network of highways and set up in any location. So some of these were actually cement made, but the other idea was that it actually has to be fully mobile. The design of these units was actually inspired by Narkomfin's F unit, as we saw before. which has already at this point, it was selected to be the typology for the Soviet house. Which was basically these standardized schemes known as the Stroikom units. And actually the Stroikom units later on inspired Le Corbusier's unit d'habitation. So an edition of the F units, it became a prototype for the disurbanist mobile pods. They were cubicles that could be easily attached, detached, and reorganized with one another according to the social needs of their occupants. So a married couple, for instance, they could connect their pods side by side, and once divorced, uncouple them and go their separate ways. So architecture would partially substitute the judicial bureaucracy of social relations, laws, and protocols. Ginsberg, Okhitovich, Zelenko, and Alexander Pasternak, who was Boris Pasternak's brother, the poet, they submitted their plans in 1930 to the competition for the planning of the city of Magnitogorsk, which is known for its massive iron ore mining industry. Their design was essentially a machinic infrastructure, a network of interlinked ribbons with each sine wave representing a belt of agriculture, cultural facilities, factories, highways, and railroads. For Okhitovich, basically the sharp angle was a residue from the capitalist allocation of land. Therefore, the use of these curved lines. The end of the city would herald the socialist sprawl, echoing with the real estate expansionism of overpopulated metropoles like Los Angeles today. So for all their shortcomings, these were considered innovative and untested ideas targeting the ancient divide between the city and the countryside, making best use of what each has to offer without favoring one over the other. Disturbanists also submitted their sketches to the 1929 Moscow Green City competition. The picture that you saw above, the Moscow being crumbled and thrown away, that was also part of it. So while other architects were preoccupied with reforming Moscow into a more spacious, efficient, and egalitarian capital, the duo suggested to demolish most of the city, turning it into a park adorned with monuments. Corbusier actually was asked to jury the contest, and he was appalled by the idea, which prompted basically a series of correspondence between him and Ginsberg, his previous champion, for the rest of his life. Like Corbusier kind of obsessively was writing about how bad disurbanism was. Like he was mainly concerned basically with the anti-socialist form of disurbanism. And when leaving Moscow, Corbusier implored Ginsberg in a letter to repatriate to the urbanist camp. And he continued criticizing them basically until his book. Some of these notes come later in his book called The Radiant City. So disturbanist ambitions also, they were quite short-lived, like despite these criticisms from major architects at the time. Okhitovich was the first architect who was sent to the camps in the very start of the Quiet Terror. Delivering a speech at a conference of non-party architects at 1935, Okhitovich argued that the national form of Soviet architecture has to be derived from the Russian formal inheritance. Since the majority of the pre-revolutionary oppressed, in his view, did not have a classical period of architecture, their national form was to be found in village housing. The form of Russian folklore then, for him, could carry the socialist content of Soviet architecture. Although he defended modernists for their revolutionary credentials, he argued that by compromising the economic base of rural life, capitalism has forced people into cities where folk architecture has been replaced by geometric forms. In the speech, Okhitovich hinted at Stalinism's neo-feudal war on peasantry, and that it would force migration to cities and exacerbate the problem of landlessness. Even after the complete victory of communism throughout the world, when nations will have been joined together in one communist people, there is no reason to assume that architecture then will be just one form and in one form for all conditions. Architecture will become local in form and communist in content. This was kind of the catchphrase. So the allegation case against him ended with a note on disurbanism representing a clearly socialist fascist point of view. And in the years when architecture was facing intensive internal conflict and pressure on behalf of the National Commissariat, the Okhitovich affair had a snowball effect with everyone joining the witch hunt. And eventually he was arrested shortly after and died in the labor camp in 1937. In his words, Okhitovich's words, this is not merely a theory of those who oppose the city. No, it is an inevitable objective process. It is not our business to go out to meet the car with our icons, as did the peasant, upon meeting the first steam locomotive on its old ground. So these issues, I think, would be best explained and contextualized if we turn into the correspondence between Corbusier and Ginsberg that was published in OSA's journal Sovremenaya Architektura, the Journal of Modern Architecture, in the disurbanist issue. So I will be playing one second, sorry. So I'm going to read the letter written by Corbusier first over this edition of the journal, and the correspondence letter by Ginsberg. I'm going to play excerpts from the video that I'm working on at the moment with the amazing Ruda Cabral, the animator who has spent a lot of time working on the project with me, for us, for others, the art directors of the project, and Mohammad Safa, who's the musician of this piece. So thanks to everyone before jumping into this. So Moscow, March 17, 1930. This is Corbusier's letter. My dear Moise Ginsberg, I am leaving Moscow this evening. I have been asked to write a report on the recent competition for the Green Town of Moscow. I haven't done so not wanting to present a judgment on the work of colleagues. On the other hand, I answered the request that was made to me indirectly by giving the Committee for a Green Town some commentaries on the development of Moscow and the Green Town. My conclusions cannot agree with the enthusiasm that the simple word deurbanization seems to raise at the moment. There is a contradiction in the term itself. This word is a fundamental misunderstanding that has deceived many Western theoreticians and wasted a lot of the time of governing boards of industries. A fundamental misunderstanding that everything opposes and refutes. Society is complex. It is not simple. Whoever tries to bring hurried and tendentious solutions to its problems will meet opposition. It revenges itself. It falls into a state of crisis. And despite changes and regulations, it doesn't let itself be manipulated. It is life that decides. Last evening in the Kremlin, in the office of Mr. Lehava, the vice president of the USSR, Mr. Milyutin, one of the commissars of the people, had the thought of Lenin translated for me, that far from supporting the thesis of disurbanism, on the contrary, confirms the necessity of urban reform. Lenin said this: If one wants to save the peasant, one must take industry to the country. Lenin did not say if one wants to save the town dweller, one mustn't confound. There is all the difference. To take industry to the country, that is to say, industrialize the country, that is to create places of human concentration with machines at their disposal. The machine will make the music think. Nature is good for the city dweller whose mind has been galvanized by the city, who puts to work in the city the diligent mechanism of his mind. It is in the group, in shock and cooperation, struggle and mutual help, in activity that the mind ripens and brings forth fruits. One should like to think so, but reality is there. It is not the peasant who looks at the trees in bloom and listens to the song of the lark. It is the town dweller who does that. You understand what I mean if, frankly, we are not fooling ourselves with words. Men feel the need to get together, always, in all countries and climates. The group brings them security and defense, the pleasure of company. But as soon as climates become difficult, grouping encourages industrial activity, production by means of which men live, are dressed, make them comfortable. And intellectual product men. Intelligence develops, is sharpened, multiplies its play, acquires its subtlety and innumerable aspects in the mass of groups. It is the very fruit of concentration. Dispersion frightens, makes poorer, and loosens all the ties of physical and spiritual discipline, lacking which men return to their primitive state. International statistics show us that the death rates are lowest in the densest agglomerations. They diminish as populations concentrate. These are statistical facts. They must be accepted. History shows that the great movements of human thought at the mathematical points of greatest, history shows the great movements of human thought take place at the mathematical points of greatest concentration. Under Pericles, Athens was closely peopled like one of our modern cities. And that is why Socrates and Plato were able to discuss pure ideas there. Consider more exactly that 10 centuries of pre-machine civilization have made these cities for us, which at the moment of mechanical expansion are a frightful and dangerous grimace. Admit then that the evil is there in that heritage and that its salvation is here to adapt the cities which will continue to concentrate themselves more and more. Statistics and concomitant elements of modern progress, transports, intellectual attractions, industrial organization. To adapt our cities to contemporary needs, that is to say, to rebuild them, as besides from their birth, they have continually rebuilt themselves. My dear Ginsberg, modern architecture has precisely the magnificent mission of organizing the life of collectivities. I was the first to proclaim that the modern city should be an immense park, a green city. But to allow this seeming luxury, I increased the density by 4, and instead of extending them, shortened distances. I can nevertheless imagine very well as a satellite to any urban agglomeration for working and living, a green town for resting, eventually organized as we due by turns every 5th day. I even pointed out in my comments that the compulsory attendance for rest, at least once in 3 periods every 15 days, could be applied like time clocking for work, and would include the practice of an adequate sport by individual prescription of the doctors of the green town. The green town becomes the garage where the car is checked, oil, lubrication, verification, or returns of the car. Besides the intimacy with nature, radiant springs, winter tempests, insights to meditation, to introspection. Please then do not see a hostile attitude in my serene and firm affirmation. Mankind tends to urbanize. Appreciate this characteristic detail yourself. One of the projects of disurbanism proposes, among other things, to build straw huts in the forest of the green town. Bravo, magnificent, as long as they are only for weekends. But do not say that having built huts in straw, you can then tear down Moscow. Very cordially yours, LC. So the next video, I should ask Firas, please, to play that for me.
I'll start now.
And let me know if my voice is clear. Hopefully it is.
Okay.
So this is Ginsberg's response. My dear Le Corbusier, our recent conversation about city planning and your letter have compelled me to rethink the entire problem, to recall your objections, the objections you made when you visited me and which you now write about in your letter. Like all my friends, I value you tremendously, not only as a subtle master architect, but also as a man with the ability to solve radically and fundamentally the important problems of organization. For me, you are today the greatest and most brilliant representative of the profession that gives my life content, goal, and meaning. This is why your ideas and solutions in the area of city planning have for us a quite exceptional interest and importance. You have often told me that you adore nature and would like to live always among greenery. You write that you were the first to advocate the luxury of an enormous park in the city. During our stroll on Tverskaya Street, the present Gorky Street, you told me that Perret and all the best of the French architects had tried to take housing out of the city. In other words, you yourself posed the problem of giving man ideal physical surroundings, a problem for which we are trying in our projects to find a radical solution. But you feel obliged to consider such a radical solution possible. In other words, in spite of your brilliant gifts, you find yourself powerless to overcome the objective contradictions of modern capitalism. A careful study of your work shows that it is in fact a consistent and stubborn attempt to round off the sharper corner of city planning and smooth and soften all its rough edges. You are the finest of the surgeons of the modern city. You want to cure it of its ills, whatever the cost. Therefore, you raise the entire city on stilts, hoping to solve the insoluble urban traffic problem. You create wonderful gardens on the roofs of tall buildings, hoping to give people an extra patch of green. You design homes whose occupants enjoy perfect convenience, peace, and comfort. But you do all this because you want to cure the city, because you're trying to keep it essentially the same as capitalism made it. We in the USSR are in a more favorable position. We are not tied by the past. History confronts us with problems that can only have a revolutionary solution. And however feeble our resources, we will solve them no matter what. We are making a diagnosis of the modern city. We say, yes, it is sick, mortally sick, but we do not want to cure it. We prefer to destroy it and intend to begin work on a new form of human settlement that will not be free of internal contradictions and might be called socialist. We know that raising a city on stilts, and you have seen that in this respect we are following your example, does not permit a radical solution of the urban traffic problem. Driving between columns is almost the same as driving through narrow streets. We know that the roof garden is an excellent architectural solution, but it cannot solve the sanitation problem, the problem of open spaces. And similarly, we would like to find a solution for the living unit, but not in the form of a luxurious private home or a European-type hotel. You yourself talk of international statistics which show that the birth rate is the highest and the death rate the lowest in the most densely populated areas. But this is only natural. The thinly populated centers are poor villages and without doctors or culture, without means and without decent food. You write that culture develops only where people are concentrated in large masses. But this is perfectly understandable. It describes the situation in a capitalist society, though not elsewhere. We in the Soviet Union must make culture available to the entire population, not merely the urban population, whatever the cost. But to do so, we cannot transfer 100 million of our peasants to the big cities, not without destroying our agriculture. Accordingly, we want all the beneficial consequences of concentration for the development of culture and at the same time all the advantages of dispersal and decentralization for spreading culture as uniformly as possible over the population. And for this, it is necessary to create new socialist forms of population settlement based on elimination of all the disparities between town and country. You are absolutely right in your high evaluation of the collective in human history, but our disagreement is not along those lines. The higher requirements of collectivism and industrial concentration demand decentralization and dispersal in space. That is the crux of the matter. I note with pleasure that you consider it necessary to quote Lenin. You say that he thought of saving the peasant by introducing industry into the village, but did not think at all of saving the city dweller. But you are wrong, my dear Le Corbusier, not only about Lenin, but Engels and Marx thought long and often about both. Or rather, for them, these were two aspects of the same problem. Permit me to quote their own words on the subject. A resettlement of mankind is necessary with the elimination of rural neglect and isolation and an unnatural crowding of huge masses into the big cities. Lenin. The separation of town and country has condemned the rural population to millennia of backwardness and the urban population to being mere wage slaves. It has destroyed the basis for the spiritual development of the former and the physical development of the latter. Engels. The contradiction between town and country is the coarsest expression of the subjection of personality to the division of labor, which transforms the individual into a limited urban animal on the one hand and a limited rural animal on the other. Marx. You refer to Perez's unsuccessful attempts to take housing out of the city, but this too is quite understandable. He severed an isolated member from a complex organism. That member inevitably wasted away. We are removing from the city nothing less than the city itself, its entire system of supply and culture. In other words, we are creating a whole new organism. This is quite different from what Perez was trying to do. You write that the peasant does not love flowers and does not hear the song of the skylark. But of course he doesn't when he's exhausted with backbreaking labor. But we want our peasant to listen to the skylark, and we know that for this it is only necessary to lighten his labor and bring more culture into his life. And all this will be possible not by smoothing out the contradictions with which the modern capitalist system is riddled, but by creating new forms of human settlement more worthy of the future. We are aware that we have yet to find a solution to this very difficult problem, but we cannot refrain from posing it. We cannot refrain from trying to solve it. That is our duty, the duty of the architects who would like to become the architects of socialism. Moreover, we hope that in the future, as in the past, we shall be able to learn a great deal from you, and that what we learn will help us to solve our new and difficult problems. Cordial greeting from myself and my friends. Yours sincerely, M. Ginsberg. It's the last few seconds of the video. So basically, I forgot to mention this video. I worked with an architect who built these models from like the few hand-drawn sketches and basically the sketches that were available from this, primarily in this journal that I showed. So she reconstructed these 3D models and we use them in the video. And Narkomfin is the main building. Now you can see it in the distance. So this is it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bahar. This was incredible. Maybe now we can open up this space for like questions and answers. We'll also get a few comments from Firas. Whoever wants to basically ask Bahar a question, you can write it down in the chat box and we will read it out to her. But yeah, thank you a lot. Thanks a lot. And I just wanted to open up with one thing that sort of connects this conversation to one that we were having like earlier this year when we launched Internet of Things. I was looking at your description of the work after scarcity, which you said early in the lecture sort of laid the basis for this project. And somewhere in the description you write, and after scarcity, Noorizadeh explores the historical past in search of our possible future, which is something we sort of went back to time and again the past few months. So I guess in relation to that, my question would be, what is it about this past that you sort of like engaged with today that continues to be at stake in our present day engagement with the politics of possibility and futurity, especially if it's the kind of politics that concerns itself with notions such as the commons or a life in common, etc.
Yeah, I think that's basically central to both of these projects. Their intention, I mean, I started from my discourse is kind of like based towards like, construction of the future of different possibilities. But the more I engage with that, the more I see that there is so much of, of the future in the past that I have to, that is overlooked and does not actually, is not processed yet. And especially in this sense, these histories of alternative networks can say so much about, our imagination of networks at the moment. And I think this is primarily also the work with after scarcity. It's not so much, because usually the conversation that comes up with after scarcity is that, now we have, now we have these mega platforms. Now, there's the Chinese state was practicing like a similar type of economy or a similar kind of usage of networks. But of course, these are not ideal. It's not to say that, this model at the moment is perfect and it has to be, it can be like recuperated or captured. That's one possibility, but mainly to be able to reimagine the very kind of essentialist notion of technology, or the essentialist ideas around technology, as there was a moment that that possibility could bifurcate and could not be solidified into this like hegemonic singular or like monolithic form. that's very that very idea can be applied to how we think about, you know, these these models and systems and structures today, not necessarily as a way of you know, taking them as, you know, the ideal form, but being able to question their very medium, not as like, you know, not necessarily as tools, but as means, you know, as yeah, not in this like instrumentalist basically approach towards technology, but taking their formation seriously. So I think this is kind of at the basis of both these projects.
Yes, would you like to share a few comments before we take questions?
Yeah. Yeah, I have like yeah, like a lot of comments actually. Thank you, Bahar, first for this very amazing like talk, and like also exploring this concept that you are working around and researching on. Yeah, but that, like, I'm thinking of actually of two parts, like basically the part that has to do with the concept and the part that has to do with the work itself, the video. What we saw that, or also this medium that you are using mostly in your practice. Like when I go back to the concept, I'm thinking about this from Michael work. Like there's this part that he's using. I mean, he's coming from very modernist kind of architecture design, part of the Communist Party and everything, and then I think there was like this case of him following Trotsky, which contradicted with the Stalinist regime, etc., etc. But then he, like his plans of this urbanist city and demolishing and abolishing the concept of the city, and then also like his mainly argument. I mean, there is this argument that has to do with the healthcare of the human health, that has to do with, like, I don't know, less dust, less noise, less, I don't know, sickness, and I don't know, even like, I don't know if him or Ginsberg, like, we're talking about like ways of dealing with what the capitalist city brings, and to avoid it by this I don't know if we call it city. I mean, they called it the green city, no? But also, like, in the same time, they were mentioning, or I think they were like more or less talking about the real green city. They were even mentioning that you could see like buildings that they are concrete and steel, and they have a lot of greens on them. This doesn't make it green. And then the usage, like there is this argument that has to do with the health and the human condition, and the other argument has to do with the advancement of technology. So like the acceleration, the motors, of course, acceleration of also communication systems, no? Between so like you don't have to be all together in the center, but not to have a center basically, and to build communities and social structures that they are, there is distance in between. So you have like more parks, I don't know, there is more life, no? And this brings me to, I don't know, like also like thinking now from the ecological question that we are facing, that has to do in two parts. I want to focus here, the virus as part of the things that actually this movement, they were actually trying to say from that time that, hey, this overcrowding is not good for for the workers themselves, no, and the proletariat. So now, and it came also from Wuhan, from also like let's say a communist or self-claimed a communist country, you know, like China, and it came from this, from Wuhan, and now it's invading the whole world. And the second question that has to do actually with the climate change, and you know, this whole discussion about, I don't know, apocalypse and extinction and etc. that we're supposedly like to face by the next few. I mean, we're facing now, but like I guess it's gonna accelerate also within time. So like, what do you think about these connections between that time of like when it came this movement in late 20s, and also like with what we're living now in this political and social context.
Yeah, I think so. Actually, I was connecting this work to a second chapter, which was looking at the history of social housing in Hong Kong and how Hong Kong developed from this kind of utopia of neoliberal, you know, the neoliberal city, like the kind of case in point of like neoliberal city that's highly functional, into like, you know, this kind of the most like luxurious. Basically, at some point by the 80s, it had the highest rate of social housing in the world, like 80% of the population were living in social housing, and then like within the past 40 years, it became the most luxurious like real estate hub. So in basically reading this, you know, this prehistory of network city into this like new form of like globalized city, like to kind of like bring it to the present moment, as you're saying. I think something that's becomes like more and more evident is that obviously cities are not like sustainable. Now the primary function is, you know, for services and the finance industry. But also like something that like in that research on the Hong Kong urbanism I was studying was this scholar Manuel Castells, the sociologist, and he's talking about why, like, you know, why internet basically, you know, what we think about today with this, like, you know, Zoom life, that like the coming of internet was the moment that the city had to already, like, you know, perish. Like there was no need to function like this anymore, but obviously it didn't happen. And one of the prime reasons that he finds for this, like, you know, on a very kind of like proper sociological research, is that actually the finance industry and the services industry, they still need to do business face to face. Like, you know, this is not the this is really like why, you know, we still have the concept of the city, because first with surveillance, they don't trust communication over internet. Like, you know, that's very old school idea of like, you know, holding meetings in like golf clubs and lunch meetings, like they're very much in place. And if that's kind of like, you know, sustaining the basis of, you know, the cities today, it's kind of like amazing. But yeah, in terms of where do we go from here? Also, like, I think it's interesting to look at this urbanism in its relation to, like, you know, the kind of like urban sprawl or urban gentrification. I mentioned it somewhere in the text. But maybe that's not the best case example of this, because I think, again, what happens is that you need this technology to function in a different system. And as long as it doesn't function in that system, you just like fall into, you know, it doesn't fulfill its function. So the network city in a capitalist context is, you know, we have it, not only the urban sprawl, but the mega city, which is also a project that China is trying to build around Hong Kong and Guangzhou and like the cities around, to basically build this parallel model to Silicon Valley. Like they built this the longest bridge in the world between Hong Kong and Macau. This entire project is part of this mega city architecture. And part of the reason why like China is insisting so much to bring Hong Kong into its legal territory, because for this to work, you need to standardize the protocols. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's also kind of like an open-ended question. Yeah, I'm just like throwing things out, but
Yeah, I'm thinking like also like of like also like this idea, like now since also you mentioned Silicon Valley, I'm thinking like it just came to my mind the architecture of Apple Park or Apple building, like headquarters in Silicon Valley, that also actually they used similar concepts, no? Because they are like Apple, they are claiming political, I don't know, like you know, like climate awareness and justice and etc. And you know, like these kind of, yeah, taking over like some political claims in the mainstream to reproduce it and to get, I don't know, economy out of it. So like the building is designed like as a circle in a basically in a huge park, and using these elements. Of course, it's not really. I mean, I would say it like I would see it as not really like the buildings. There was also like this functionality, you know, of the design from Ochitowicz and this group. Like there is a focus on the functionality. So you have like this inside the rooms, the workers or the people who are living there, the natives, I don't know, they wouldn't have this a lot of space to walk around. I mean, you can go out of the building and then you can work like how long you want, but inside the building you don't have this space. You have this chair, even like how it was the architecture drawings. So it's also still kind of stuck in that area from that like from this part that has to do with architecture, while now like there is this more, I don't know, like promote, like especially like it's used on this solar punk kind of genre, like that has to do with yeah, like I mean science fiction of how the human societies will function then, like with collectivity, and then you have these spaces and you have like you are using this advancement of technology but also still using gardening, and but you are gardening and I don't know, like some weird technology that is being invented. And this brings me to the video work you presented here. And it's on process, no? It's not like you were saying like you were working on it still and you did the editing recently for this presentation. So I'm thinking like about this usage of rendering like images, rendered images to describe like life and how it was measured. And and also like thinking about the concept that, or parts of the concept that we're working on in measuring life, and on the impossible exchange between life and system of abstraction and design and social design, and where is this conflict happen, no? So here from this concept, and then also like from the video you presented here, like there is this heavy, yeah, rendered images with heavy sounds that reminded us, or me at least, like there is this very industrial sounds, no, like in the like I don't know, metal structures clashing, or like this very heavy, not very comfortable sound to hear. So yeah, like I would like if you could say something more about this, like this also, like there is this kind of alien shape forms, and also like they were talking about this alien city and like how these forms, they were moving in between one spot to another with these, I don't know, kind of communication, like advanced communication systems. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess in terms of sound, Safa would be like the right person to discuss the intricacies of how he made it, but I think it was a quite amazing process. We basically had a conversation about the ideas discussed here with decentralized networks and yeah, dispersion of these elements. And I think what he did was to create a system, kind of algorithmic system, and taking the output from like many instruments kind of clashing with each other. And we worked on after scarcity together also. So it's a continuation of kind of that conversation. And in terms of like the modeling and the architectures, I think because like the thing is with Soviet avant-garde ideas, I feel like there's this tension, there's a historical tension, obviously, that there's like this uncomfortable like positioning in a time frame that's you that you can't like, you know, that you can situate it in a historical time frame, but also you can kind of extract it from this timeline. So like my sense is like, you know, usually when you discuss these communist past, there's a tone of nostalgia and there's a tone of like, you know, melancholy of that, see, it didn't happen. So I think this is how, like with after scarcity and with this one, but even like maybe more explicitly with after scarcity, the idea was to really extract that moment as it was in animation without discussing, you know, all the troubles that came after, even though within the works it discusses why they failed. But like the failure also is not part of the usual narrative of like the Cold War failure of these projects. They were much more kind of embedded in the system, and there's so much misunderstanding of, you know, how socialist systems were functioning. Like basically with after scarcity, the argument is that it didn't fail, like the Soviet cybernetics project didn't fail because the system was too centralized. But actually, on the other hand, it was so nepotistic and informal that it actually led to so much resistance from like each participant. Actually makes it like much closer to a capitalist society. Exactly. So to kind of like extract that moment and like not lead to like the visual kind of like the aesthetic normalization of the, you know, of the communist past, I think that's kind of what I'm trying to do maybe with these projects, to find a different way of looking at them.
Actually, Bahar, I have a question around something that's like at the core of their concept, and maybe we can end with that unless someone has a question they'd like to ask Bahar. So I'd like to go back to this like proposal around like demolishing the city altogether, because, you know, like it's quite radical. It's like we don't deal with the binary, we demolish the binary, we negate it altogether. And then now, like a few minutes ago, you say in many ways we're already there. So we're already, at least on a certain level, in that future they're talking about or theorizing back then, except that capitalism is very far from being like out of the picture. So maybe like a few thoughts on that kind of tension.
Honestly, this is actually at that point that I'm not sure, you know, talking about this history and to say that I completely comply with their arguments, I don't think are the same thing. There's a work being done with bringing imagination, and there's another thing to say that I completely agree with this, you know, removal of contradiction, because I think eventually, like I don't think even Marx or Hegel like imagined that, you know, you can completely get rid of contradiction. The contradiction will persist no matter what. Which I think basically the entire idea of this urbanism was for them built around removing the contradiction of, you know, living structures or like, you know, urban structures, which, yeah, that's why like even when we have, there's still a form of contradiction, like in a capitalist society have it and it's completely contradictory. I don't know, it's becoming like maybe too abstract at this point.
Yeah. And maybe like we can also like contextualize it on the conversation on computation, because that is also like at the core of this program's conceptual framework. you know, like the point of departure for us was this sort of like conversion of everything to like a calculable or computable entity, versus this like description of the economy in hegemonic discourses using the same vocabulary used to describe the human body, right? So I'm just, because I know you're also like, this is one of the things that your work explores, specifically maybe like in after scarcity also, it's something that you focus on a lot. So maybe we can also like end with a few thoughts on that.
That's actually a very good question, because I think I wasn't really aware of that aspect until you brought it up. Because basically what I'm kind of writing about these days on the PhD side of things is these projects of rationalization and, you know, ultra planning that was actually, you know, everything we think of it at this moment is, you know, is shaped within like, you know, capitalist ideology, but actually they're all derived from socialist thinking, like socialist thinking of scale. Like back in literally like in the early 20th century, because they had to think about management of an entire state, they had to like, you know, think about computation. So they're already kind of concocting the idea of computation back then. But in a sense, like desurbanism and like similar models like that resemble desurbanism in capitalist states during 20th century seems like a reaction to that rationalization, in a sense. Like it's more of the, you know, the individuality, but like these things at this moment become very convoluted, because like the moment we start talking about this kind of like hyper stressing of like, you know, the role of the individual, then we kind of start falling into the neoliberal discourse. But I mean, just to kind of like take this somewhere, I think what's happening is that in the 20th century, all of these ideas are jumbled up, like neoliberalism, socialism, neoclassical economics, like, you know, capitalist computation, like they all meet at like different intersections and they borrow from each other, and it ends in this like strange shape of capitalism today, which is actually very contradictory in itself.
Yeah, that's actually the perfect conclusion to
It's a mess.
Exactly. All right. Thanks a lot, Bahar. Just a note to everybody, Measuring Life will be coming to an end in 2 weeks. We will be concluding with a final conversation on politics of the commons and commoning and so on. So this is sort of like a very nice transition into that conversation. You can find all the information about the event on our Facebook or Instagram. And that's it. Thank you, Bahar. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a lovely night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bahar.